Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We welcome those of you who are here in Antiquarian Hall, as well as those joining us on YouTube tonight. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. We are proud to have the chief of the Hassanamisco Band of Nipmuc, Cheryl Tony Holly, with us here tonight. Thank you for coming, Cheryl. We're welcome. I'm Scott Casper, and I have the honor of serving as president of the American Antiquarian Society. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce the 20th Robert C. Barron Lecture. And before I introduce our speaker, I'll tell you something about Bob Barron, for whom this lecture is named. Bob is the founder and president of Fulcrum Publishing. He's also a historian, a scientist, and the author or compiler of 25 books, including Pioneers and Plotters, The American Entrepreneurial Spirit. Before Bob became a publisher and an author, he was program manager for the Mariner 2 Venus and Mariner 4 Mars onboard space computers. In 1971, he founded Prime Computer, which became one of the Fortune 500 largest American companies, and he was its first president and chief executive officer, building it into a worldwide business. Bob Barron was the chair of the American Antiquarian Society Council, that is our board, for 10 years, from 1993 to 2003. From his home in Denver, he is leading efforts in Colorado to commemorate both the 250th anniversary of U.S. independence and the 150th anniversary of Colorado statehood. And we want to say, I'm sure that Bob is watching tonight, as is his wife Charlotte from Denver. So hello, Bob. We are glad you're there, and we're delighted to honor you with this lecture again tonight. The Barron Lecture brings a distinguished American Antiquarian Society member who's written a seminal work of American history to Antiquarian Hall here to reflect on the book's lasting significance and impact on scholarship and society since it was first published. Previous Barron lecturers include Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Bernard Bailyn, Mary Beth Norton, James Merrill, Jacqueline Jones, Nell Irvin Painter, and last year, Jack Rakove. Our 2025 Barron Lecturer was elected to AAS membership in 1979, 5 years after the book he will talk about tonight was first published. Peter Wood is Professor Emeritus of History at Duke University, where he taught from 1975 until 2008. And the book is Black Majority, Race, Rice, and Rebellion in South Carolina, 1670 to 1740, which was published in 1974 and reissued in a 50th anniversary edition last year. Now, when I read Black Majority in college 40 years ago, which dates us both, it had a different subtitle, which was the product of its original moment. And that subtitle was Negroes in Colonial South Carolina from 1670 to the Stono Rebellion. Black Majority was path-breaking in 1974 for several reasons that were embedded in that original title. The early 1970s, as I'm sure Peter will talk about tonight, were a banner era for studies of slavery and race that took enslaved people as subjects of their own world, not just objects of other people's actions, of white people's actions. I think, for example, of John Blassingame's The Slave Community, Eugene Genovese's Roll Jordan Roll, and many others. But almost all of those other studies focused on the antebellum period, whereas Peter Wood took the colonial period as his subject, and not just the colonial period, but the early colonial period. The book ends in 1740, 36 years before U.S. independence. And most students of colonial America in the early 1970s focused on New England. Certainly most of Bernard Bailyn's students at Harvard did. And if they were casting their eye south, maybe it was to Virginia. South Carolina was a whole bridge apart. Further, Black Majority took seriously the lives and skills and cultures that enslaved Africans brought with them from specific African communities. As Jane Landers wrote in the William and Mary Quarterly earlier this year, Peter Wood in her words, made early America vast long before others jumped on board. But even back in the 70s, colleagues immediately recognized Black majority as path-breaking. Benjamin Quarles, in the Journal of Negro History, wrote that the author's revelations are supported by a scholarly outreach that is exceptional. Willie Lee Rose, in the New York Review of Books, called the book as fine a piece of social history as the study of slavery has yet produced. And John Blassingame, himself the author of one of the pioneering studies, wrote that this will stand as a classic long after the others have passed into history. And so it has. Today, we can read the 50th anniversary edition, which Peter has lightly edited from the original. Those of you who are here in the room with us tonight can buy that 50th anniversary edition from our friends at Tide Pool Bookshop after the lecture in the back of the room. Lest anyone think that Peter Wood has rested on his laurels for the last 50 years, I hasten to add that his work has proceeded along multiple tracks during those years and for multiple audiences. He's written for young people and students, including Strange New Land, Africans in Colonial America, which is written for young readers. He co-wrote the U.S. history textbook, Created Equal, authoring the chapters on the colonial period. Combining his interest in African American history with his interest in American visual culture and art history, he's also written 3 books on the American artist Winslow Homer. He has worked on a variety of public history projects, consonant with his belief that history belongs to all of us. Equally important, Peter Wood has nurtured a generation of scholars who carry on his mantle of illuminating the lives, the work, and the political actions of enslaved and otherwise marginalized people in American history. His Duke PhD students include at least 3 prize-winning AAS members: Woody Holton, who's the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, Jennifer Morgan, who's the Silver Professor of History at NYU, and Vincent Brown, who's the Charles Warren Professor of History at Harvard. His students also include not just 1, but 2 history faculty members at the College of the Holy Cross right here in Worcester, Stephanie Ewell and Gwen Miller, who are here tonight in the front row. We are glad you're here. As David Littlefield wrote on the 50th anniversary of Black majority, while some historians establish schools of thought, Wood has fostered trajectories of thought. His students and the other historians, the many other historians he has inspired, offer ample testimony to that. Indeed, we see his influence right here in the many rising historians of early America who pursue fellowship projects here at AAS, in many cases inspired by the work of Peter Wood and his students. The very title Black majority arrested my attention when I was assigned it in a college course in 1985. Tonight, it's an honor to welcome Peter Wood to the American Antiquarian Society to give the Robert H. Barron Lecture. The title of his lecture is, "I Am So Tired of Waiting, Aren't You? Revisiting Black Majority." Peter Wood.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. This is a treat and an honor for me, and thanks to the people who are joining us via Zoom. I've gotten some nice notes from former students who said they would tune in. I appreciate that. And special thanks to Scott for the generous introduction and the hospitality, and to Nan and the whole staff here at the AAS. This is an amazing place, as all of you know, and so it's an honor to be here. I would say special thanks to Bob Barron. As Scott said, he's a scientist, a historian, a publisher, a philanthropist, is very devoted to this institution. And I'm going to have lunch with him next month in Colorado. I looked over the list of the previous 19 wonderful professors who've had this honor, and I knew most of them, starting with my mentor, Bernard Bailyn, and lots of wonderful colleagues. I think I may be the only one coming from Colorado. I've come all the way from Colorado to talk about South Carolina in Worcester, and it's a treat to be here. I take as my text this poem by Langston Hughes, written almost a century ago. I am so tired of waiting, aren't you, for the world to become good and beautiful and kind? Let us take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the rind. And in a certain way, what I did then and want to do now is cut the world in two and look at the worms and try, we're in a moment now where we're debating once again how many worms we're willing to look at. And so this poem still rings true for me. And I want to do it by touching four bases and talk a little bit. I think it's important to know who an author is and how they got there. And I want to try to talk a little bit about why I came to write this book in the first place, and what I did, what was in it that seemed so surprising at the time. That doesn't seem as surprising now, but that was quite shocking in many ways in 1974. And then to talk, as the AAS asked me to try to reflect a little bit on scholarship and society and the way in which the book has worked in that world, and why I end up talking a little bit about why it might be more relevant than ever today, even though it seems like a distant time and place. So how did I come to write this book in the first place? I was born in 1943 in St. Louis. My father was a doctor. And that's important all through what I'm going to say, because what I learned from him, among many other things, was that if you meet a patient who is sick, the first thing you do is take a history. You want to find out, when did you start feeling that way? And how did this begin? And what did you have for dinner last night? And whatever. You want to go back to the beginning before you make any diagnosis or prescribe a remedy. And so that's driven me my whole life. That's what made me a colonial historian, is if we're going to figure out the racist problems all around us, let's go back to the beginning and find out. And I'll talk a little more about that later. But it was an era, obviously I wasn't reading at 1 year old, but this is when Gunnar Myrdal was, they had to go to Scandinavia to find a sociologist who could address the, quote, Negro problem. And one of the things that he said in that wonderful 2-volume book with lots of young black sociologists and historians feeding him data was that there's no doubt that a great majority of white people in America would be prepared to give the Negro a substantially better deal if they knew the facts. He was struck, as so many folks are coming to visit our country, and especially then, of how little the general public knew about this piece of the puzzle. Keep in mind that Ralph Ellison was writing Invisible Man, and it's hard for us to understand how powerful that invisibility was at the time. So I grew up in a white suburb in St. Louis, but I was a great baseball fan, rooting for the St. Louis Cardinals. And my father took me to a baseball game in 1950, sitting behind the third base dugout. And I hated the Brooklyn Dodgers because they always beat us. And one of their players got on first base. And the entire right field bleachers started yelling, "Go, Jackie, go." And I turned to my father and said, "Wait a minute. They're rooting for the Dodgers, how does that work?" And he said, "Well, that's a Negro player. That's Jackie Robinson." And it was a segregated cheap seats. All of Black St. Louis had turned out to root for the Dodgers. And he took off and stole second base and stole third base and slid in right in front of us. And that had a huge effect on me, realizing there was something bigger than baseball that I needed to find out about. But I now realize it must have affected millions of little leaguers all over the country as his season progressed. I could list lots of other encounters like that some of you who are almost as old as I am may remember some of them. But for me, the murder of Emmett Till, I was in St. Louis, right on the Mississippi River. Here's this kid, only a couple of years older than me, getting murdered and thrown in the river. That had a big effect. And then we moved to Baltimore in the mid-'50s, at the same time the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore. And because my dad became a doctor at Hopkins, and I went to a nice private school where we had to sit in alphabetical order, and Peter Wood had to sit next to Peter Woodward. Very nice boy whose father turned out to be one of the great Southern historians, Van Woodward, who was teaching at Johns Hopkins. And he came to our class, as often works in those schools, and talked a little bit about his work. And it was the first time I realized, oh my God, my choices were not being a doctor or a baseball player. I could actually, there are people who study the past. Isn't that amazing, And he was a wonderful person and friend for the rest of his life. By the time I was a senior in college, the Birmingham bombing took place. And I show you this quotation simply to remind you, in retrospect, we often, a lot of folks say, oh, yes, my heart was bleeding when that happened, blah, blah, blah. The bitterness and the vitriol that was circulating in the country was as bad as what we're dealing with now. I mean, it was fierce, and this man, James Kilpatrick, was a vicious, racist columnist in Richmond who was very widely circulated and syndicated. And he wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post where he said the Negro as a race is in fact inferior. What, pray tell, have they contributed to Western civilization? Putting aside conjecture, wishful thinking, and a puerile jazz worship, what has he in fact contributed? The blunt answer, may it please the court, is very damn little. And he could say that straight out. Fortunately, Saturday Evening Post had the brains to pull the article after the Birmingham bombing, so it never got published. But that was the atmosphere when I was a senior in college. But with this notion that, wait a minute, I don't agree with that, but I need to find out more. When I was at graduate school at Harvard in '67, taking a summer school course trying to learn German, the Detroit riots happened. And Roger Mudd, a young reporter from CBS, was flying around in a helicopter over the city trying to explain what was going on down there. Who these people were, why they were angry, what's going on. And very much the way he'd been covering Vietnam from a helicopter, looking down, I don't know who these people are, but there's a lot of violence down there. And I remember thinking, he doesn't know, he has no idea how these people, we all know about the Great Migration and understand about blacks moving to cities in the north. Roger Mudd had no idea. He was supposed to be explaining to us what was going on. And he couldn't get to the middle of last week in terms of understanding the history that got us there. So the next morning, literally, I went to Widener Library in Cambridge at Harvard and went into the stacks because at this point I was ready to start figuring out a dissertation topic. And I started, the books were arranged by colony, and I started in Maine and New Hampshire and started moving to, and all the New England colonies had a couple of little books and articles about Negroes who'd lived in New Haven or this and that. In Philadelphia a little bit, Virginia, one or two books. I got South Carolina, it was absolutely blank. There was nothing. And there were a couple of books that I pulled off the shelf that said, you cannot understand South Carolina unless you were born under a magnolia tree and understood, it was basically this, leave us alone, just don't look at our history. And for a young graduate student, that was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. Oh my God, there's only 13 British colonies, and they've been studying them for 200 years, and there's still one that we hardly know anything about. So I'm going to go there. this is the world, this is the invisible man world of the mid-20th century. This was a map created by the National Park Service of European migration. So no Native Americans. It's an empty colony. Nobody coming from Africa. No arrows coming from Africa. And that was considered a complete picture of what you needed to know about 18th century North America. So I went to my professor, Bernard Bailyn, and said, I want to go to South Carolina. And instead of saying, no, you can't, he generously said, well, you're not going to find very much, but go ahead. When I finished, I just thought of this morning, today as Scott was talking, when I finally finished the dissertation, he said, well, that's good, you really wrapped it up. Like okay, we're done with that. Whereas I was saying, what was your word, trajectory? For me it was like, okay, this is the beginning of a trajectory, and we got a lot of ways to go. But I headed off to South Carolina in 1970, which turned out to be the tricentennial year of the founding of the colony. And they had they were doing an exhibit in Columbia, South Carolina, celebrating, and they pulled together various cotton gins and different things to show South Carolina history. And I'll never forget this, they had grad students showing people around the hall. And so this grad student took me and said, here, this is a cotton gin, and this is that, and that's Robert E. Lee. And they had all these blown up photographs on the wall. That's Robert E. Lee, and that's Stonewall Jackson, and that's that son of a bitch Grant. And I said, what? I said, wait a minute, he's wearing a U.S. Army uniform. What do you mean? And he said, oh, excuse me, where are you from? Did this whole backing off. And then another grad student who was working in the library said, what are you working on? I told him, he said, I didn't know there were slaves in those days. And I put that in the introduction. I said, just not to diss him, but just that was the atmosphere. They literally didn't know. And 10 years later, I went to South Carolina to give a talk, and they sent a grad student to meet me at the airport. He says, hello, Dr. Wood, I'm George. I know there were slaves in those days. He didn't make it to my introduction. So South Carolina, some of you have been there at various times, not many of you, I'll bet. Not enough, but it was very different from what it is now. The so-called Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which has federal funding from 4 different states and really celebrates Black Low-Country culture, that was non-existent. The big, fancy second houses like that now line the islands, all through the Sea Island area, were not there. You could still see rows of slave cabins, and in fact, there were several where elder Black people were still living in the cabin. I think this picture really summarized it for me. I found it just a couple of years ago. The EPA had just been founded, and they sent photographers out to take environmental pictures. They sent somebody to South Carolina, and he got this photograph of creating one of the first golf courses at Seabrook, and just bulldozing 200 years of history and ecology, and 2 African-American men, descendants of the Black majority, sort of standing on the side, staring at what's coming, which is going to be endless golf courses and second homes. So what did I find when I got there? Well, I've tried to summarize it in the subtitle of this new edition as Race, and Rebellion in South Carolina. In the first edition, the subtitle used the word Negroes. I had to change that. But it also used the word Stono Rebellion, because there was this huge, the largest rebellion in 18th century North America, and nobody had ever heard of it. And I thought, well, even if they don't read the book, they're going to have to, know that there's something called Stono. Now I don't have to do that because that's become, it's somewhat well known compared to what it was before. But those three themes really represent what I encountered with this idea that this was a black majority as early as 1708, that the rice that was being grown that was making it such a rich colony had actually been grown in West Africa, and it was these people who were being brought were skilled workers, not unskilled workers, and they were teaching the Europeans, not being taught by them, and that they were resisting slavery. Because part of that mid-20th century image was that not only do these people not have any agency, they're not bringing any knowledge with them, they're also contented and there is no resistance. Why are there so few slave revolts in North America would be the question the students would ask, and the answer was often because we haven't looked, and we haven't recorded them and written about them. And I think these pie charts give you a sense, really, of what I was bumping into. You can see that the much larger, older colonies of Virginia and Massachusetts, we know that 2% is very different from what's going on in Virginia, but it's only in South Carolina where there's a real black majority of 60%, and the effects of that are huge culturally, because it means that you're associating with more fellow Africans, not necessarily from your group or nation, or you're learning from other Africans, but you have much that you share, and you're pooling that knowledge and information in all kinds of areas, whether it's language, religion, food, dress, music, all these different things are coming together, and you're also interacting with Europeans and Native Americans. And so when you start to look, the Gullah culture, as it's called, on the right that evolved, was very close to what you can still see certainly in 20th and maybe even in 21st century West Africa. So pounding rice looks pretty much the same, as does making baskets. Some of you who've been to Charleston know that that's an ongoing tradition that comes from West Africa. And winnowing the rice in those big flat fanner baskets was something that had been familiar in West Africa and was then carried on for generations in the low country of South Carolina. So and of course, you make the basket and then you use it until it is gone and disappears, and you make another one, so it's biodegradable. So we have very few 18th century fanner baskets, but they're a real icon of early America, like the weather vane and the butter churn and all the things that you see when you go to New England colonial sites or Sturbridge Village. But we don't, and we should honor them the same way. Mostly what these people were doing was planting and digging ditches to irrigate rice fields, very much the way they had done in West Africa on the left. And still we're still finding new things, of course, every year and every day. And over the years, I could list you half a dozen of people calling me up out of the blue and saying, those people you wrote about, did they do this? Did they do that? And I would say, well, they did a lot of things, tell me. And so learning about the clay pots they were making or the quilts they were making, so on and so forth. A former student of mine discovered 2 years ago, she grew up in South Carolina, and she discovered this wonderful picture from Mulberry Plantation made in 1916 of a man still using what's called a cayendo, which was the same carved wooden shovel that had been used in West Africa. And so it was persisting even up to 100 years ago. But she only published an article about it 2 years ago. Nobody had ever heard of this before. So it's as though you wrote an article last year about the New England weather vane. Like, wow, did you know they had weather vanes in New England? Whoever knew? So this, the deeper I dug, to use the phrase, the more I learned, and this is a monumental achievement. That it's like the pyramids in Egypt, of being built by generations of enslaved African labor, and you can actually see the canals and irrigation ditches from space, from the air. Many of them are grown over now and covered up, but if you they're now using LIDAR to photograph, and they can go over a forest in South Carolina. It eliminates the trees, and you can see all these ditches, miles and miles of ditches. And if you put them, they now calculate, if you put them end to end, you could dig a ditch from Charleston to Seattle and back. This is generation after generation spending their time in the fields, and the end result is something like this. You can see there's the Harriet Tubman Bridge in the distance, but you can see the remains of these rice fields that were the entire landscape, and you can really see them now from aerial photography, which is wonderful and beautiful. A friend of mine took these pictures, and when you just drive through the flat countryside, you don't see them. You might get a glimpse of a canal somewhere, but from the air, they're very visible. So let's talk a little bit about the impact on scholars and society. And that's it, scholars and society. And I'm going to argue that it had a big impact on scholars and just about nothing on society. And so it was very, very well received. But partly just because the timing was so good. The publishers were desperate for books. The universities and the students were pressing for more books on Black history. They were publishing things that were before copyright. They were just grabbing books off the shelf and reprinting them. The Arno Press did a series of books. They were desperate to get these books. And so I thought, when I sent the manuscript to Knopf, I thought, well, they'll critique it and want me to dust it up, and in a year or two it'll get published. And they signed a contract in 2 weeks and said, we're going to print it, and which means it still rings a little like a dissertation in some ways, but the timing was great. I'll tell you one story. I went into their office in New York, and they said, they showed me around, and then they said, you need to go talk to our publicity director. She's down the hall. And I walked into her office, the big burly blonde New York publicist woman and her face just fell. And she said, "Oh, Dr. Wood, I thought you were a Negro." And then she thought I was the guy on the cover of the book. And she pulled herself together and she said, "That's all right, we'll get you on the radio." But it was that moment where we'll take anything we can get. I did an article for the William and Mary Quarterly called "Hey Man, Where Did You Come From?" where I was at a talk at Princeton, and these black students were trying to critique the lecturer, but they didn't have any ammunition. This was before I published the book, and I said, well, I've been working on this thing in South Carolina. There was this big rebellion called the Stono Rebellion, and they cut off people's heads, and they did it. And this black freshman in front of me, just his head whipped around. "Hey, man, where did you come from?" Because there was this desperation. We're not invisible men. We need these stories, and we especially need stories about resistance and skills. So this idea that these people were skilled many people were receptive to it. Not everybody. This is This is the library at Jerry Falwell's University and Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, and they had a rubber stamp on the title page that basically says, you know, this book is here so we can get our accreditation. However, it's just for reference, and it's not an endorsement of the contents from the standpoint of morals, philosophy, theology, or scientific hypothesis. It is necessary to use books whose content the college cannot wholly endorse. You know, so I treasure that with some pride. But we're back into that world, and so it's funny until it's sad. So in terms of this question of my own, I mean, an author is the last person to ask about the impact of a book, but I really feel that certainly personally, it's been an incredibly fulfilling journey, but also in terms of the scholarly world that many of us live in, it's been very affirmative, and the trajectory has been good. And as you mentioned, several generations of students pushing the boundaries further and learning more, new technologies. I talked about LIDAR. We could talk about a lot of other ways, that things that just weren't even available to me, but that are available now. So in terms of the personal and academic world, I feel as though my cup runneth over, you know. But I really feel as though in terms of the wider public, it's much less than I hoped or realized or understood. As I said, my father was a doctor. I assumed that if you laid out some convincing argument and it was peer reviewed and everything, you know, then it was published in some journal and people said, oh, okay, we get it. Now we'll move on. And that really has not happened at all. And it's been a reminder to me, and it's a reminder that all of us are wrestling with right now, of realizing how narrow our world is very often. You know, it tends to be very academic or very intellectual, or people who like to read books, or people who love history. But we're, and I grew up assuming that all filtered out wonderfully and readily into the wider society, and it really hasn't. So I got tired of waiting. I went, as Scott said, I went on and wrote books about Winslow Homer, and wrote a textbook, and have written an article about ancient dugout canoes on the Mississippi River, and an article about why Gerald Ford pardoned Rich and Dixon. And I've just tried to follow things that interested me, hoping that times would change. And of course, they changed when George Floyd was murdered 5 years ago. And the Black Lives Matter movement really took on steam, and it felt very much like the late 60s. In other words, the publishers were saying, we need more books about this. We got to dig deeper. You know, a lot of people say, why didn't I learn about this in high school? And so, and a young generation very aware that they're reading racist, whitewashed, harmful history books. These are actually descendants of the black majority that's still living in Columbia, South Carolina. And so W.W. Norton asked if I would revise the book and bring it, do a 50th anniversary edition. There was no way that I could incorporate all the scholarship that's been done, all the new things. I didn't want, in a way, it's still a period piece. I did cut a lot of paragraphs in half and do things that I knew people would have trouble reading it, because thick books are scary these days. But I was hoping that the interest would overcome that, and they did a beautiful job. I said, I'll do it if you'll put him back on the cover, because this is a wonderful Jericho painting from the 19th century that really captured, when it first came out in '74, if you did a Black History book, first of all, the cover was going to be black, just so you get it. Don't want you to miss anything. This is Black history, And then there would be a little woodcut of a runaway Negro, carrying a little duffel bag or something, just some little goofy picture. And I was like, no, I want him up there. I want. This is an African living in France in the 19th century. He's not, but he's wearing a red coat, which is exactly what you were given by the enslavers if you ratted on your neighbor. If you were loyal, if you were, then you got a red coat and you could wear it around. Anyway, he represents a lot of what's in this book. So finally, why might Black Majority be more relevant today? And I think I have a couple of thoughts on that, one of which I wouldn't have had last year, but I have now. The first one I would have had last year, and it's that we do history backwards. And we do, I think I alluded to this at the start, that we tend, when a talking head comes on TV to explain Charlottesville or talk about racism in America, they talk about the Civil Rights Movement and Rosa Parks, and then they might talk about the Jim Crow era and segregated schools and bad books and underpaid teachers and that kind of thing. And then they'll talk a little about Reconstruction. There's been a renaissance of books on Reconstruction. And then Civil War, a little of that. And then there was slavery before that, and you know about that, so we don't have to cover it much. And but for me, the doctor's son, it's like, wait a minute, let's go talk to the patient, in 1710 and find out what's going on in South Carolina and where that came from. This is just a timeline that I made up that really, I guess, that shows that, if we're in 2025, we work backwards, and to work back to the Civil War is not very far as race relations in America goes, and so it's really in Carolina and in this period that I call the terrible transformation of the late 17th century, where African enslavement really ramps up, that's where the enslavement begins and the racism to rationalize that enslavement. We're doing it because these people are stupid and they're not Christian, and therefore it's okay for us to keep on doing this, and that persists all the way through the rest of our culture. But the thing that I wouldn't have said last year, since last October, a lot of us have been reading books and talking about the rise of fascism and trying to understand what that's all about. Has it ever happened before? Could it happen here? All those kinds of things. And one of the books that I read was this book by Michael Ebner about ordinary violence in Mussolini's Italy. Some of you have seen this. I haven't seen it yet, but there's a Mussolini series, I think, that's being run on television now. And because people are thinking about these things and how does this come to be? And what Ebner found in Italy was that the fascist state ruled Italy violently, projecting its coercive power deeply and diffusively into society through confinement, imprisonment, low-level physical assaults, economic deprivation, intimidation, discrimination, and other quotidian forms of coercion. Moreover, by promoting denunciatory practices, the regime cemented the loyalties of, quote, upstanding citizens while suppressing opponents, dissenters, and social outsiders. And that's grist for the mill for us to think about, is that going on now? But for me, it's grist for the mill to think about, was this going on? Is this what I was writing about in Black Majority? Isn't this what it was? It was an oligarchy. It was a one-party state. It was and these were not plantations. These were slave labor camps, and all the elements that he describes here of coercion and intimidation and giving people red coats if they're loyal hold true. So my sense is, I don't want to exaggerate it, but I do feel that if we would look further back in time, further south, Worcester, further south, and we would find the deep roots of some of these things, and that the roots have never died. You know, the Civil War did not cut the roots. Reconstruction did not change the game. You know, and while the Germans, within 20 years after fascism, understood the mistake they'd made. I mean, and taught about it in schools, and it became a real piece of their late 20th century culture. And that it took them about 20 years to turn that corner. And it's taken us 150, and we still haven't turned that corner. So still more to think about. I hope the book is still relevant. I hope some of you will pick up a copy if you're not familiar with it yet. And I appreciate your attention. I look forward to hearing your questions and ideas. Let me end just quickly by showing you this slide, which is my ambition for the next generation. That's the son of one of my students with a new copy of Black Majority. So I'm hopeful. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that wonderful talk. We have plenty of time for questions. I'd only ask that if you have a question, please raise your hand. We will bring a microphone to you so everybody can hear your question, as well as the people on YouTube being able to hear your question. We'll also have questions coming from our folks on YouTube, so feel free, if you're in our virtual audience, to ask questions as well. And we'll just open it up for people to ask questions.
Please. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And, you know, you talked about the impact in the academic community and society, but there is another group that I think about, having taught this book a number of times, and that's undergraduate students. And I think the book reads so well, works so well. There's the, you know, black people do this, white people do this to stop them, black people do this, and it goes on. And I always look forward to, when I taught it, having a Black Majority Discussion Day, because it was almost a day off for me. I just had the students react to the book, and they did in remarkable ways. They seemed to love it. Except for one day. One day, one of the best students in the class, a young African-American woman, didn't say a word. And I talked to her after and said, "What's going on?" She said, "It just hurts too much. It's just too painful to read that." But, you know, I won't say that aside, I'll say including that. I think the impact of the book, its readability, the argument, even the graphic nature of it, I thought was really very powerful for students. And so as you kind of toed up the influence, I'd say that goes on the record too.
Well, let me pick up on that idea of it hurts too much. I mean, I think that can happen, you know, and I think let's say in the last 15 years, you know, we've seen a certain growing sensitivity to triggering and, you know, like, you know, somehow things that we talked about more broadly maybe 30 years ago, it's like, oh, I'm not sure I want to go there. But on the other hand, the opposite sense of I want more. And when I reread it and tried to think about how I could revise it for a next generation of students, I tried to toughen it up. I mean, I felt that in retrospect, I mean, I thought I was being tough and candid and clear 50 years ago. And first of all, it hadn't gotten across to the wider public. That was clear. But it didn't it didn't tell half the story, in terms of, and these are little issues of language. I now, instead of saying plantation, I often say slave labor camp. I often refer to it as a gulag, and I tried to use language, that was not inflammatory, that was more realistic, that was just when I went into this in '74, I knew that it was going to be violent. I knew slavery was not, a happy pasture. But I was not prepared for the violence. I had no idea they were cutting off people's testicles and chopping off your foot if you ran away and cutting off your thumb if you read a book and things like that. And we don't have, even though we live in, I'll tell you a funny story. There was in the 1980s, I guess, they discovered a lot of the slaves in the Stono Rebellion, actually, and others slaves in South Carolina. If you were going to escape, you weren't trying to go north. You were trying to go south to Spanish Florida. You wanted to get to St. Augustine because the Spaniards trying to mess with the British had said, any slaves who want to come here, they'll be free, and so. That whole notion of escaping certainly showed how violent it was. Anyway, anybody else, please? Yeah.
Peter, it would be great to hear you reflect on Judith Carney's work.
I can't hear. I've got my hearing aids.
All right.
Turn it up.
Judith Carney's work. I just wondered if you could reflect on Judith Carney's work on the rice culture and the sort of gender division of labor and sort of how that built on your own work, or is that not familiar?
Judy Carney, is that who you're asking about?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Okay, and gender was in there too. Okay, sorry, I missed it. Judy Carney is one of these people who called me up and said, I've been studying rice cultivation in West Africa. I'm a West African anthropologist. I just read your book. I didn't know they were growing rice in South Carolina. And she spent her whole career studying this diaspora of rice growers all over the world, and now they can track which brand of rice it was and all kinds of things. And so we became fast friends, but it was a wonderful example of these people, often from other disciplines. She was an anthropologist. Leland Ferguson was an archaeologist in South Carolina, who said, he just called me up out of the blue after about 10 years. He said, I read your book, and we're on these colonial sites, we're finding, and this is a great story, we're finding these clay pots, and the low-fired small pots, and we took them to Williamsburg. Williamsburg is the arbiter of all things colonial, and they had a pompous British archaeologist named Ivor Noel Hume who was in charge, and Ivor would decide, and he looked at it and he said, well, it's not Delftware, so. And surely the Negroes didn't do anything, so it must be made by the Indians. So we will call it colonial Indian ware. And that's what I want you to do in all your articles and everything else. And so Leland was calling me. He was a young, just out of grad school. He said, I don't think this is right. He said, because we're not finding them on Native American sites. We're finding them on these plantation sites. And they're all over the place, but they taper off after about 1800. And I said, well, do you know what happened in he's an anthropologist, not a historian. Well, what do you think happened around 1800, Leland? That was the end of the slave trade. And so these Africans were not coming. But he then took this and ran with it, made a career out of it. He's passed now. He's a wonderful scholar who went to the West Indies and found, oh my God, the slaves were making these clay pots. And then he went to West Africa. Oh my God. And he thought they were soup bowls. And so, and the West Africans said, no, this is religious. This is a sacred bowl. Don't you see the marking in the clay and everything? So he made it just out of that. So that whether it's the cayendo or the clay pot Or, I mean, the classic example, which I didn't talk about, is the banjo, which most of us associate with Grand Ole Opry or Appalachia, and it's an African instrument, as Thomas Jefferson wrote and understood. He said they play and it had a gourd resonator, and the Africans grew gourds. So I wrote a whole article about follow the drinking gourd, about this idea of that was one of the things these people coming from West Africa knew all about gourds and put them to use. They knew all about palmetto trees. If you've ever seen the South Carolina flag, it has a big palmetto tree on it because palmetto trees were so weird for these Englishmen coming. But for the West Africans, it's like, no, that's how you make these baskets. You strip off the leaves and you use parts of the tree, and they were familiar with all that. So they were coming into a more familiar environment than it was a very river-oriented environment. The Indians were using dugout canoes, and the Africans had used dugout canoes, and the Europeans had to learn. Yeah. Anyway, yes.
What a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. In the last couple of decades, there's been a kind of resurgence of heirloom seed culture and historic rice cultivation. And South Carolina is a place where that's really taking place. And I'm wondering if you think that's a kind of impact because Geechee culture and rice cultivation now are actually considered kind of a hipster activity. So I'm wondering if you think. So there's this whole heritage seed culture, heirloom seed. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, yeah, it's they now. Yeah. They are proud of it in a certain way and market their rice, but they still don't want to talk about the enslavement of it. It's as though, I mean, and these are not death camps. You're not trying to kill these people. You're just trying to work them and never pay them a wage. Never paid their whole life, and their children are going to inherit the same thing. Now, is this rice, and you can't eat the rice you're growing. And I'm going to claim that I showed you how to grow rice. I mean, within 20 years, that was the story that was going on in South Carolina when I got there. It's like, oh yeah, we had to show them how to grow rice, they had a wonderful story about a seed from Madagascar. There was some captain in East Africa who brought some rice seeds from Madagascar, and it's just not true. I mean, and Judy Carney found, I should have shown it to you. I don't know how she found it, but if you go, it's probably in the Essex Museum or something. If you go to one of these museums that's full of sea pictures of all these ships, there's a painting of a slave ship, and because the guy who owned, I don't know, somehow somebody painted. It's not a very good painting, but you can see the ship, and you can see a few figures on the deck, and you can see that there's a black person doing just what I showed, pounding rice. So when you load up your ship in West Africa, and the last thing you do is just buy a lot of this rice, put it on board, and then tell the people when you let them out of the hold for an hour a day, if you want any food, you tell your women to cook up pound this rice and cook it up. That's up to you, and so it's not costing them anything, and so rice. And there are stories about African women hiding rice hairs in their braids and so on, but there's not. What struck me was that the evidence was so overwhelming, and Judy, I hadn't been to West Africa and seen all this stuff, but Dan Littlefield, whom you mentioned, wrote a whole wonderful book called Rice and Slaves that documented it. He even found a picture in a captain's log where he'd drawn a picture of these people out in the field with their cayendos and, harvesting rice. it's undeniable. And yet, I would get really negative pushback from, and not from the Fitzpatricks of the world, but from other academics. Like, no, that could, often English academics who felt that white people figure out everything, I don't know. Yes, please.
Hi. When I taught history in high school, I would work to make the students understand that when the black people first came and the indentured servants, that people were running off together, fighting against, the powers that be, or people were getting married, and trying to explain to them that racism wasn't always what it is. And I didn't know if you could talk more about the evolution of racism, or the evidence that you had that there wasn't the racism that we understand today in those early days. Because there is, you don't create a law against black and white marriage unless people are getting married.
Right, and
Thank
you don't
you.
renew the law every 6 years unless it's not working. Yeah, absolutely. It's one of these complicated questions that keeps people chewing for generations, because there's no question that visual discrimination is as old as the earth. That trying to figure out whether somebody is a friend or an enemy or a marriageable partner, so that's always been there. And Europeans were, though they were varied and argued with each other and could easily tell a Swede from an Italian, what's striking is that in the colonial literature, it's not until 1680 that you get the use of the word black and white. Usually, the initial distinction in North America and all over the world is Christian or non-Christian. Are these people heathen or are they part of us? And if they're heathen, how fast can we Christianize them? And those darn Spanish Catholics have a good idea that you just baptize, you make them Christians and then teach them later. Whereas the Protestants were saying, no, they've got to recite the catechism, and they've got to, John Eliot here in Massachusetts, and I wrote about John Eliot as an undergraduate. He was one of the things that got me started was John Eliot's relations with the Native Americans. And then about 20 years later, one of my students became the librarian at SMU. And I was down there to give a talk, and he said, "Come on, I got something to show you." And he showed me Eliot's Bible. You may have one here, I don't know. It's that thing. This is a labor of love. I thought, well, he translated a few sentences. No, this is huge. It's amazing. So that idea of wanting, are you Christian or not Christian? Do you understand or not understand? And it's only after enslavement begins that this, because in China, they used to call it rice bowl Christians. Have you ever heard that expression? That when people were starving in China in the 20th century and the missionaries were trying to convert them, I'll give you a bowl of rice if you'll just cross yourself or say you're on my team. And we're like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So when Africans realize, oh, you mean I'm not a Christian? Okay, I'm a Christian. Boom. If that's what's going to get you off my back, I'll do it. So that's a loophole that they had to close. And that's where the leopard cannot change its spots. It's like, no, we're not doing it because you're heathen. We're doing it because you're black. And that distinction starts appearing, and it's really in that period, as I say, I call it the terrible transformation from, say, the 1660s to the 1720s, where enslavement is ramping up and the rationalization of it is ramping up. So it's the beginnings of what becomes this overwhelming negative stereotype, that lives down through our present culture. And we've chipped away at it, but it started so early, and it was ingrained, and they clung to it so long that because they were making money hand over fist, because they never paid their workers. You know, imagine if the Worcester Mills had never paid their workers. They didn't pay them much, right? And it was pretty terrible and all that stuff, but they were on the bottom rung. But if you're not even on the bottom rung, then you get the Stono Rebellion. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Wood, for an excellent talk. I have not read your book, but I certainly plan to. I'm a little bit younger than you are, but I remember growing up and going through school that I learned zero about slavery. Maybe just that there were slaves and then there was a Civil War. Your book apparently opened or pulled back the curtain on that and gave us a lot more information. And other books have as well. But now we're in an era where our government is telling the Smithsonian Institute, oh, you can't say so many bad things about slavery. It makes people feel bad. So I wonder if you'd like to comment on that trend and what we can do to stop it.
It's a tough one, and we're all wrestling with it right now. I do take heart in the fact that 50 years ago, you know, that kid who said, hey, man, where did you come from? I mean, we were dealing with pretty close to a blank slate, you know, in terms of our knowledge. And now, if you want to say, oh, you know, there was no Stono Rebellion, or, you know, this never happened, or they all learned to read and write when they were 6, you can say it, but the evidence is just overwhelming, you know. So it means that I'm not saying they're not going to try, but they're working very hard to bury that. And one of the things that I find, have any of you ever been to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Alabama? Anybody? Yeah, couple. Okay. Well, tell your friends. You know? I mean, and what's amazing about it is not only that it's the best museum in the country, and that it covers slavery and lynching and civil rights and the whole ball of wax. It's not funded by the federal government. It's not the big museum in D.C. It's not even the flashy but a little bit hypocritical museum in Charleston, you know, where imagine Charleston, South Carolina saying, well, now we're going to explain enslavement to you. You know, they're not the people you would pick to do that. It's an interesting museum, and it's a wonderful tourist. You know, they take people now off the cruise boats, and they can go through there, and it's good. That's an effort, I guess. And I should. But the point about Brian Stevenson's museum is it's private. He's on his own. He has done this on his own, and it means that, you know, no government official can come in and say take that down or rewrite this. He did a wonderful piece the other day where he talked just about that. One of the icons has become that famous picture of a man. I think his name is Hunter. He's a black man who was severely whipped, and after the war, he served in the Union Army, and then after the war, they took a picture of his naked back, and you could see the huge scars, you know. And he was saying, you know, you can't take that picture away from us. You know, we need that. You know, and what I'm saying, I was telling Scott earlier, I'm working on a project now that goes, I hope, a step further, which is, those things are terrible, and we know the physical violence and abuses of slavery pretty well. We can deny them and say, don't talk about them so much. But think about this. The entire Africa, 9/10 of the African-American population lived in the South before 1900, you know, so this is a Southern story. And for 200 years, African Americans, including non-slaves even, but mostly the enslaved majority, were not allowed to read and write. So this is not physical abuse, this is mental abuse. You know, this is, I do not want you using your mind. I want you hoeing cotton or picking tobacco, but I mean, how many illiterate people do you know? Nobody. You know a friend of a friend who blah blah blah. I mean, we can't imagine. But imagine if everybody in this room was illiterate. It's just we can't fathom that. There were more. In 1850, there were 152 public libraries in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Okay? In that same year, 1850, there were 156 public libraries in the entire South from Delaware to East Texas, with 9 times the population. It was a book desert, and we don't know about it, and inflicted on African Americans. So I mean, you know about the rush to establish schools during Reconstruction, and that's what was behind it. It's like, wait a minute, for 200 years I have not been allowed. I've been cleaning the books in my master's library, but I haven't been. All the libraries that were in the South were Thomas Jefferson. The big planters had big libraries, wonderful collections of books, but who got to read them? 17 people. They were cloistered. So we've got a lot more to think about. I mean, I don't even know where that leads you, thinking about being that cut off from thought for. And one response is, oh, we have oral traditions, and it's we don't need that. That's true. There were vibrant oral traditions and people with incredible memories who could memorize things and remember all sorts of stuff. But to be cut off from everything, and this wonderful quote from James Baldwin is one that I used in the first edition and kept in the second edition, because it really says it all to me. As usual, he said it better than most of us, but it's for sure. Thanks a lot.
This is why we do the Barron Lecture. It helps us think about how our understanding has changed, in some cases hasn't changed as much as we might think it has, over the many years since the book was published. Peter, thank you so much. That was marvelous. I'd like to thank all of you who are here tonight, whether you are here in person or here on YouTube. If you would like to buy the book here in person, Peter's told me he'd be happy to autograph the book for you. We have it in the back thanks to our friends at Tide Pool Press. We keep all of our programs on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to recommend this to your friends and to others, and to recommend all of our programs to others. And we have many more programs coming up over the weeks ahead. You can find them on our website, which is AmericanAntiquarian.org. Once again, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and thank you, Peter Wood.